This is MTG Burgeoning, and in this video we are going to update and upgrade our Kozilek the Great Distortion EDH deck. Thank you for joining us for another installment of the Up and Up series. Today we're going to make 5 changes to our Kozilek the Great Distortion deck. We got 5 cards going in and 5 cards coming out, so let's start with our very first edition, and that is going to be yes, the Flayer of Loyalties. Here we have a 10/10 Eldrazi with Trample and Annihilator 2 for 8 and 2 colorless mana. Now, for the purposes of this deck, we don't have to worry about the colorless mana requirements to cast this spell, because this is a colorless commander deck. However, if you were trying to squeeze this bad boy into a deck that sports one or more colors, be sure you have colorless sources, because those two diamond pattern spaces to the upper right-hand corner of the card indicate colorless mana and not generic mana. With that in mind, here we have the Flayer of Loyalties, and when we cast this spell, we gain control of target creature until end of turn, we untap it, and until end of turn it has base power and toughness of 10/10, gains Trample, Annihilator 2, and Haste. So when we cast this bad boy, even though we can't send it into combat because it doesn't have haste itself, we get to pick a creature on the battlefield that's under our opponent's control. Not quite, because it doesn't have to be an opponent's creature. It just says gain control of target creature until end of turn. So we could use one of our own creatures as well. Keep that in mind for all of those combat shenanigans on our side of the battlefield. And when we do, that creature gets 10/10, Trample, Annihilator 2, and Haste. Oh baby, Flayer of Loyalties is going to make quite an impact in a deck that wants to swing with some biggins. Keep that in mind, because with that card going in, the card it's going to replace is the Phyrexian Triniform. Now here we have a creature with a similar mana value and a similar power and toughness. Here we have a 9/9 for 9 mana. No evasion whatsoever on this creature. No built-in sacrifice outlets like the Annihilator has on the Flayer, or any other type of removal. The Phyrexian Triniform presents a different type of dynamic for this deck. And that is, when it dies, we create 3/3/3 colorless golem artifact creature tokens. Now, in pure colorless decks, we don't have a litany of different spells or abilities that can put a bunch of colorless creature tokens onto our side of the battlefield. Phyrexian Triniform does have this, particularly through its Encore mechanic. When this bad boy is in our graveyard, we can pay 12 generic mana and exile it from our graveyard, and then for each opponent, we create a token copy that attacks that opponent this turn if able. The token copies gain haste, and we sacrifice them at the beginning of the end step. We can only Encore as a sorcery. Now keep in mind that if we are able to sacrifice these creatures at the beginning of the end step, or if they die during combat, they will trigger their death triggers and create those 3/3/3 colorless golem artifact creature tokens. So with one successful Encore of Phyrexian Triniform, we could, if we have at least 3 opponents at the EDH table, we could get 9 3/3 golem creature tokens. That's a total power and toughness of 27 stretched across 9 bodies. That does give us a little mini army, of which a colorless deck generally is lacking. The reason why we're going to take out the Triniform for the Flayer of Loyalties is because we're looking to swing with impact creatures. We want each combat to be impactful. We want it to resonate throughout the game, and with Phyrexian Triniform, even in a colorless deck with so many mana rocks for ramping, we do need to invest 21 mana in order to get the Phyrexian Triniform to give us the biggest bang for our mana investing bucks through its Encore ability. And that's if we get it onto the battlefield for the first 9 of that 21 mana. So we're looking for impact that resonates over the potential of creating one of those token armies. We'll see how it works during gameplay, and if we have to revisit this swap in the future in another episode of the Up and Up series, then we will. All right, edition number 2. That is going to be the Skittering Cicada. Here we have a 2/2 insect with flash for 3 generic mana. This allows us to cast colorless spells as though they had flash. Please note, we are emphasizing, not emphasizing, I don't even know if that's even a word. We are emphasizing the colorless spells as though they had flash. Keep that in mind. Every spell in this deck is a colorless spell. And whenever we cast a colorless spell until end of turn, Skittering Cicada gains trample and gets +X/+X, where X is that spell's mana value. We've got some true biggin spells in this deck, which we can really pump up the power and toughness of Skittering Cicada, and the evasion enablement with trample being there, we have the ability to do some massive, impactful combat damage to one of our opponents with the potential of one-shotting one as well. So with Skittering Cicada going in, coming out is going to be Liberator, Urza's Battlethopter. Now, keep this in mind. It's a 1-for-1 swap. The Liberator here is also a 1/2, and it has the evasion with flying, and it also has flash, and it has a mana value of 3. This also says that we may cast colorless spells and artifact spells as though they had flash. So here we're pretty much getting the exact same creature. The flying is there. The power and toughness is a little bit different, a 1/2 versus a 2/2, but still, so far, everything else is pretty much exactly the same. Where it differs slightly is Liberator gets a +1/+1 counter whenever we cast a permanent spell if the mana spent to cast that spell is greater than Liberator's power. Now, the +1/+1 counters will stay on Liberator. The power and toughness boost that the Skittering Cicada gets is just until the end of turn. Now, the +1/+1 counters will build gradually over time, but we are going to get to a point where it most likely is going to cap out with the majority of the spells in the 99 of this deck. With Skittering Cicada, there is no limitation or restriction to those power and toughness boosts. As long as it's a colorless spell, it's going to get jacked and it's going to give it trample. That makes, in a vacuum, the Skittering Cicada the superior card over Liberator, particularly when we consider that it's going into a straight colorless build. For the moment, Skittering Cicada better than the Liberator. Card number 3 going in, it is the Obtrusive Archaic. Here we have a 3/4 avatar for 4 generic mana. It has Vigilance, and we can pay 1 generic mana and tap it to copy target activated or triggered ability we control from a colorless source, which is every source in our deck, and we may choose new targets for the copy. This pretty much is a creature version of a somewhat similar artifact in the deck, which is the Strionic Resonator. But here we have it as a creature, and we have a lot of activated and triggered abilities with, strewn around the 99 of this build, including a couple of cards that we just added in Flayer of Loyalties and the Skittering Cicada. With the Archaic going in, it's going to replace Pilgrim's Eye. Now here is just a 1/1 Flying Thopter for 3 generic mana. It comes into play, we search our library for a basic land card, which in this deck is a Wastes, and we put it into our hand. So it doesn't put it onto the battlefield, so it doesn't really ramp us. It helps us with a land drop, but it doesn't ramp us. And this deck is slowly starting to churn to a land base that is the predominant feature of non-basic lands. We are going to keep some wastes in there because it would be a little irresponsible if we didn't. But it seems like Pilgrim's Eye is not as good of an overall fit for this deck as the Wandering Archaic is. And we're going to see during gameplay and testing if that is an accurate assessment. Card number 4 going in, we have, here it is. You knew it was only a matter of time until Zuladodul Void Gorger came in. Here we have a 7/4 Eldrazi for 5 generic mana and 1 colorless mana. And colorless spells we cast from our hand with mana value 7 or greater have Cascade. Talk about ramping even more in a colorless deck. Zuladodul is going to give that to us as long as the spells we're casting from our hand are at least a mana value of 7. That means with cascading twice, we're going to exile cards from the top of our library until we exile a non-land card that costs less, and then we cast that card without paying its mana cost. We do it 2 times each time we cast a spell with a mana value of at least 7 if Zuladodul is on our side of the battlefield. That is extraordinary power. If you didn't think you can ramp even harder in an all-colorless deck, oh man, wait until you can get Zuladodul onto the battlefield and you start cascading away through that library. With this Eldrazi going in, it's going to take the place of Burnished Heart. Here it's an elk. We all know what Burnished Heart can do. Generic mana cost of 3. Mana cost of 3 generic mana for a 2/2. We pay 3, we sacrifice it, we put 2 basic land cards, which in this deck, of course, will be 2 wastes, onto the battlefield tapped. The thought process here is, again, referencing Pilgrim's Eye exile from this deck, we're slowly shifting away from wastes and focusing on more and more non-basic lands. And with Zuladodul going in a vacuum, of course, it's going to be a much, much better replacement than what Burnished Heart can do. But to make up for the 2 basic land cards that Burnished Heart puts onto the battlefield through its sacrifice, and let's face it, it's a generic mana value of, a combined mana value of 6, mana cost of 6, a combined mana cost of 6 to do that. Zuladodul's cascade ability, if we hit 1 spell with at least 7 mana value in our hand, could put 2 different mana rocks onto our side of the battlefield that can give us a way more mana than the 2 wastes we can put onto the battlefield through Burnished Heart's sacrifice trigger. We're going to see how it works, folks. That's what this is all about. We're updating, we're upgrading, and we're hopefully optimizing. All right, the last change, the last card going in here, it is, yes, Karn Legacy Reforged. Here we have Karn as just a legendary artifact creature, not as a planeswalker. Generic mana value of 5. Karn's power and toughness are each equal to the greatest mana value among artifacts we control. So Karn has a floor of a 5/5 for 5 mana. At the beginning of our upkeep, we add a colorless mana for each artifact we control, and this mana can only be spent to cast artifact spells. Until end of turn, we don't lose this mana as steps and phases end. So with a very high concentration of artifacts in this colorless build, Karn is going to give us free mana to use to cast those spells. With Karn going in, the card that's going to come out is Blinkmoth Urn. Now here we have an artifact that costs 5, which is the same mana value as Karn, and at the beginning of each player's pre-combat main phase, if Blinkmoth Urn is untapped, that player adds a colorless mana to their mana pool for each artifact they control. A couple of thought processes here is, by taking out the Blinkmoth Urn, we are denying our opponents the ability to benefit from that free colorless mana. Even 1 or 2 or 3 stray mana rocks on their sides of the battlefield gives them this free mana, which helps to ramp their game plan even more. More likely than not, we benefit from the most amount of colorless mana, but it would be so much better if we were the only ones to benefit from it. Enter Karn Legacy Reforged. He does not provide that ability to our opponents. He only provides that ability to us. Yes, we can only use that colorless mana for artifact spells, but that's not going to deter us. We have so many artifacts in this build that mana should never go to waste. Blinkmoth Urn helps our opponents, while Karn Legacy Reforged only helps us. All right, there you have it, MTG BC. We updated and upgraded our Kozilek, the Great Distortion EDH deck. Let me know your thoughts about these changes in the comment section below. This is MTG Burgeoning, a channel for all things magic.